Have you ever met someone who could make you feel like the most important person in the room, and yet, somehow, also, like you didn't exist at all? There is a particular kind of presence that feels warm at first, captivating, magnetic, radiant, but the more time you spend with it, the more you notice a quiet chill beneath the glow. It is the warmth of a candle, not a fire, bright, enticing, but unable to truly heat a room. This is the paradox of the narcissistic personality, not a monster, not a villain, but a person shaped by a wound so old and so deep that they had to build a self out of reflections, applause, and fragments of admiration just to survive. You might recall the way they look at you intensely, almost reverently, as if you are the answer they've been waiting for. And for a moment, you believe it. They make you feel seen. They mirror your dreams, your humor, your desires. But soon, the intensity shifts. Their attention is no longer a gift, it is a hunger, a need to be adored, praised, held above all others. The connection begins to feel less like intimacy, and more like a performance you didn't realize you were cast in. They crave love, but they do not know how to receive it. They chase admiration, but it slips through their hands like water, never enough, never lasting. And every time someone gets too close, every time a flaw is glimpsed or a boundary is drawn, something inside them flinches, a panic, a tightening, a fear of being exposed. So they retreat, or they attack, or they pretend nothing happened, anything but let you see the fragile self beneath the mask. The confidence you see is not confidence at all, it is a shield. A carefully constructed persona, polished daily like armor, because beneath it is a terror of being ordinary, a terror of being unremarkable, a terror of being unseen. There is a loneliness here, a loneliness so profound that the person who carries it cannot even acknowledge it. To do so would mean confronting the emptiness they have spent their entire life trying to outrun. So ask yourself, how does someone learn to build a life that depends on being adored while never allowing themselves to be known? How does a child become a performer? How does a smile become a disguise? The answer, as always, begins long before adulthood, in a childhood where love was something earned, not given, where the child learned to shine not because they wanted to, but because they feared what would happen if they didn't. Have you ever seen a child who shines just a little too brightly? The kind of brightness that feels less like joy and more like effort, as though their smile has been rehearsed, polished, perfected. There is a particular silence behind their laughter, a carefulness in the way they look for approval before celebrating themselves. You may not notice it at first. Most people don't. But if you look closely, you can see it, the performance. Imagine a child in a house that looks loving from the outside. A home full of trophies on shelves, framed photos of achievements, applause echoing in memories of school events and birthdays. The parent is always there, cheering, praising, proud. But beneath the celebration is a quiet rule, one the child learns before they even have words for it. You are loved when you impress me, not when you are gentle, not when you are scared. Not when you are hurting, only when you shine. And so the child shines. They learn to read faces like maps. They watch every shift in tone, every raised eyebrow, every sigh of disappointment. Emotional attunement becomes survival. They learn which version of themselves earns affection and which one is ignored. The real self, the one who feels lonely, afraid, uncertain, gets tucked away, stored somewhere deep, somewhere quiet. What steps forward is the mask, the performer, the child who becomes the pride of the family. Psychologists call this conditional positive regard. It is love that feels like air, present only when the performance continues. The child's nervous system adapts. Their identity molds itself around applause. They begin to believe that being loved and being admired are the same thing. They learn to fear their own ordinariness, because ordinary meant unseen, ordinary meant forgotten. And the parent, they may never realize what they are shaping. They may believe they are raising a confident child. They may think achievement equals worth. But the child learns something far more dangerous, that emotional needs are shameful, that vulnerability is weakness, that only the extraordinary deserves affection. So the mask grows with them, it matures, it evolves, and eventually the performance becomes so seamless that even they forget there was ever a real self beneath it. Before they ever demanded admiration, before the charm and the confidence and the hunger to be special, they were simply a child trying not to disappear. A child terrified of being ordinary, because ordinary meant invisible. What happens to a child who learns that love is earned, not given? They grow into an adult who doesn't know who they are when nobody is watching. So they build something to stand in place of the self, something beautiful, impressive, undeniable, a mask polished daily, a character refined through years of attention and subtle desperation. You might look at them and think, what confidence, what radiance, but if you listen closely, you can hear the faint echo beneath it, the sound of someone holding themselves together. You see this most clearly in how they enter a room. Not gently, not quietly, but as though the room were a stage waiting for them. Their smile is perfectly timed, their charm deliberate, their presence undeniable. They know how to captivate, how to shine, how to make you feel like the world tilts slightly toward them. But the shine is not warmth, it is camouflage. The spotlight must never turn off, because when the camouflage is providing tend to, the lights go down, they are forced to face the emptiness they fear. Romantic love becomes the most fragile stage of all. At first, they adore you, elevate you, mirror your thoughts and passions so closely it feels like destiny. But soon, the affection begins to feel like possession. You stop being a person and become a reflection, a polished surface for them to see themselves in. If you step out of the script, if you show needs they cannot manage, if you simply stop admiring them for a moment, something inside them fractures. And they either pull away or tighten their grip. Friendships follow a similar path. They do not want equals, they want orbiting moons, admirers, a quiet audience. They must be the talented one, the desirable one, the one with the most interesting life. If someone threatens this position, someone more successful, more liked, more praised, the mask shifts. Comparison becomes resentment. Charm becomes quiet hostility. The performance adjusts to maintain superiority. And then there is the digital mirror, social media, a stage without end, a place where identity can be edited, curated, retouched into something worthy of applause. Here, the mask finds fuel. Here, the performance becomes religion. But beneath all this, the swagger, the beauty, the humor, the radiant self, lies a truth so fragile it can barely be spoken. They do not know who they are without being admired. The castle they built is impressive, but the foundation is sand, and it holds only as long as others believe in it. Their entire identity depends on others believing in the mask. And what happens when the world stops clapping? Have you ever wondered why someone who appears so confident can unravel at the smallest hint of criticism? It seems impossible, almost contradictory. How can a person who stands so tall collapse so quickly? But when you understand the psychology beneath narcissism, the paradox begins to make sense. Because what looks like strength on the outside is often a survival strategy on the inside. Psychologists describe narcissism not as arrogance, but as an injured self, a fragile core wrapped in layers of armor. In childhood, when emotional needs were ignored or love was conditional, the developing self was never allowed to fully form. Instead of growing a stable identity, the child built a mirror self, a version of themselves shaped entirely by how they are perceived. This is known as the narcissistic personality structure. Not a choice, not vanity, but a defense. From an attachment perspective, this is trauma. Not loud trauma, not the kind the world recognizes, but quiet, invisible trauma. The trauma of not being emotionally reflected. The trauma of being praised but not known. Neuroscientists suggest that this disrupts emotional regulation pathways. The child learns that vulnerability leads to rejection, so the brain adapts, it builds walls. It learns to survive through control, appearance, and performance. And then come the defense mechanisms. Grandiosity, the exaggerated self-importance, isn't pride, it is protection. A shield against shame. Meanwhile, projection, the act of accusing others of what one fears in oneself, becomes a way to avoid confronting the mirror directly. If they feel inferior, they may call someone else weak. If they feel jealous, they may insist the other person is envious. Anything to avoid touching the wound beneath. There is also the painful gap, described in self-discrepancy theory, the distance between the real self and the ideal self. For the narcissist, this gap is enormous. They are always chasing the ideal, the perfect, admired, untouchable version, because the real self feels unworthy, small, invisible. The chase never ends. Even empathy tells a complicated story. Studies show narcissists often have high cognitive empathy. They can understand what others feel. They can read emotions well. They can mirror those emotions convincingly. But emotional empathy, the ability to feel with someone, remains underdeveloped because feeling deeply is dangerous. It threatens to flood the very shame they are trying to avoid. So they guard themselves. They harden. They perform, not because they do not feel, but because feeling has always been the place where the pain lives. Narcissism is not the absence of emotion, it is the fear of drowning in it. Have you ever watched a flame consume everything it touches, not out of malice, but simply because that is the only way it knows how to exist? Narcissistic hunger works the same way. It is not a hunger for love, as love requires vulnerability. It is a hunger for admiration, validation, and attention, the kind that arrives quickly, brightly, intensely, and disappears just as fast. Like oxygen to fire, like sugar to a starving body, the satisfaction is instant and gone within seconds. And so, the hunger begins again. You may have seen this in the way they love. At first, the affection feels overwhelming, like being lifted into a place where you are the only person who matters. Psychologists call this idealization, but to you, it may have felt like destiny. They study you, mirror you, amplify your best qualities back to you. It feels like being understood in a way no one ever has before. But this is not mutual intimacy, it is possession disguised as connection. You are not loved, you are claimed. And then, almost without warning, the warmth cools. A subtle withdrawal, a distant glance, a shift in tone. Suddenly, the same person who once praised you now criticizes the very things they once admired. This is devaluation. The mask slips, and you are no longer a source of admiration, you are a reminder of the emptiness they cannot escape. Sometimes the silence that follows is not quiet at all, it is weaponized. The silent treatment becomes a form of control, a way of saying, you only exist when I decide you do. You feel confused, ashamed, desperate to make things right, even though you did nothing wrong. This is how the cycle keeps spinning. There may also be triangulation, the subtle introduction of another person into the emotional space that once belonged to you. A friend, an ex, a stranger, mentioned casually but meaningfully. A reminder that you can be replaced. A reminder that they are the one with power. Your insecurity becomes the proof of your attachment, and therefore their control. And throughout it all, something quietly tragic occurs. They plant gardens in people's hearts, beautiful, blooming, full of colour, but they never water them. They never nurture, never tend, never return to witness what they seeded. Because to nurture would require presence, and presence would require vulnerability. And vulnerability would require acknowledging the wound they are forever running from. So the cycle repeats, person after person, relationship after relationship, stage after stage. The narcissist destroys the very relationships that could have healed them, and the hunger remains endless, aching, devouring its own source of survival. The fire burns brightest when it is closest to burning everything down, including itself. Have you noticed how the world no longer asks who you are, but how you appear? How worth has quietly shifted from being felt to being seen. You live in a culture where identity is curated, filtered, presented, not discovered. A world where the spotlight is no longer a rare stage, but a constant expectation. And in such a world, the narcissistic mask is not an exception. It is rewarded, encouraged, even admired. Think about social media for a moment. Not as technology, but as a psychological landscape. You are taught to document your life instead of live it, to market your joy, to broadcast your milestones, to convert moments of humanity into moments of performance. And every like, every comment, every digital applause becomes a subtle confirmation. You exist, you matter, keep shining, don't stop. The self becomes a product, and the product must always remain desirable. The narcissist simply learned the rules early. They understood that the world loves confidence more than honesty, that it prefers the polished version of a person, not the vulnerable one. And so, their mask, once constructed in childhood, now finds soil to grow in. They become the person who knows exactly how to pose, how to speak, how to attract attention in a way that feels almost effortless. People call them magnetic. They call them inspiring. But what they are really seeing is someone who cannot risk being unseen. Our culture worships the extraordinary, the exceptional, the unforgettable. We tell children, you must stand out, you must be special, as if being ordinary, being human were a failure. But when everyone is trying to stand out, nobody truly connects. Everyone performs. Everyone hides. Everyone is terrified of disappearing. And then there is the relentless demand to be successful, to always be achieving, climbing, proving. Hustle culture doesn't just reward ambition, it demands identity to be built on accomplishment. If you slow down, if you rest, if you simply are, instead of becoming, you risk losing relevance. The narcissist does not invent this pressure, they embody it. They are the reflection of a world that has forgotten how to be still, a world that teaches that self-worth must be performed, displayed, validated, externally, a world where the loudest are heard, not the truest, a world where depth is optional, but visibility is mandatory. So perhaps the narcissist is not a distortion but a mirror, showing us what we collectively nurture, reinforce, and celebrate. When a society teaches people to brand themselves, identity becomes performance. And when identity becomes performance, the mask stops being a disguise and becomes the only face you know how to wear. Have you ever stood in front of a mirror and felt like you were looking at someone you almost recognize, but not quite? That subtle sense of not fully inhabiting yourself, like you're present, but also oddly distant. For the narcissist, this feeling is not a moment, it is the atmosphere in which they live. There comes a point where the performance becomes exhausting. The mask that once felt like protection begins to feel like a coffin, polished, admired, and airtight. On the outside, they may still carry the same charm, the same confidence, the same carefully curated image of a life that appears full. But inside, there is a quiet collapse, unfolding, a chronic emptiness that seeps into every waking hour. Relationship after relationship begins the same way: intensity, excitement, the promise of something extraordinary. But intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability threatens to expose the self they have spent their entire life guarding. So closeness becomes uncomfortable. Love begins to feel suffocating. They pull back, they push away, they sabotage. Not because they don't want love, but because love demands that they be known. and being known feels like annihilation. This creates a cycle of attachment and abandonment. A longing for connection, followed by the fear of it. A hunger to be adored, followed by the dread of being seen. Partners, friends, and lovers begin to feel like mirrors reflecting back the parts of the narcissist they cannot bear to confront. And so relationships do not end with closure. They end with confusion, silence, or blame. Not because they don't care, but because acknowledging loss would mean acknowledging the self beneath the performance. The emptiness deepens with time. The more the narcissist depends on external validation, the more fragile it becomes. Admiration fades, people move on, the spotlight shifts, and without applause, the self begins to flicker. Anxiety rises, depression whispers. Identity fatigue sets in, the exhaustion of maintaining a self that does not exist without an audience. This is the tragedy. The narcissist does not merely fear rejection, they fear being ordinary, being unseen, blending into the world of imperfect, real, human connection. But the more they try to rise above humanity, the more disconnected from humanity they become. In the end, it is not the world that leaves them, it is they who leave themselves. Trapped in a reflection they cannot step out of, loved but never touched, admired but never known, surrounded yet profoundly alone. And so the question emerges softly, painfully. How does someone learn to collapse the mask, to return to the ordinary, to let the real self breathe again? The path forward is fragile, but it begins with the smallest willingness to be seen. Have you ever realized that the hardest journey you will ever take is the one back to yourself? Not the self you show the world, the polished one, the admired one, but the self that sits quietly beneath all of that, waiting. For the narcissist, this journey is not just difficult, it is terrifying. Because to heal, they must turn toward the very thing they have spent their entire life running from, the ordinary, unpolished, unperformed self. Healing begins not with self-improvement, but with grief. The grief of recognizing that the mask was never strength, it was protection. The grief of seeing how many relationships were lost, not because there was no love, but because love requires letting someone touch the parts of you that aren't perfect. And for someone who learned as a child that imperfection meant invisibility, this feels like stepping off the edge of the known world. Shadow work is the slow process of turning toward the parts of the self that were exiled long ago, the hurt child, the terrified adolescent, the lonely adult. It is the quiet courage of sitting with shame instead of running from it. Neuroscience tells us that emotional avoidance only intensifies distress. The feelings we refuse to feel become the prison bars we live behind. But when the narcissist begins to name what was once forbidden, fear, sadness, inadequacy, the nervous system softens. The monster in the dark becomes something human. Learning secure attachment means allowing relationships to be mutual instead of transactional. It means practicing presence instead of performance. It means letting someone love you without needing to impress them. At first, this feels like suffocating, like standing in a room without walls. But slowly, the body learns that intimacy is not a threat. That being known is not the same as being destroyed. And then comes emotional tolerance, the willingness to feel without drowning. The ability to sit with disappointment, rejection, or criticism without collapsing into shame. This is the muscle that was never developed in childhood. It grows slowly, through honesty, through practice, through patience. Finally, identity must be rebuilt, not as a spotlight, but as a home, something internal, something solid, something that does not flicker depending on who is watching. This identity comes from asking quieter questions. What brings me peace? What feels true when no one is looking? Who am I when I am not performing? It is here, in this quiet rebuilding, that healing truly begins. Because the narcissist was never afraid of others, they were afraid of themselves. And when they finally stopped running, when they turned toward the ordinary self, they once feared they discover something extraordinary. They were human all along. What if the thing you have been chasing all your life was never the thing that could save you? What if admiration, praise, and being unforgettable were only echoes, loud, shimmering, temporary, while the real nourishment has always been something softer, quieter, more human? The world teaches you to shine, but it never teaches you how to simply be, and so you learn to perform instead of exist. You learn to impress instead of connect. You learn to be seen instead of known, but every performance ends, every spotlight dims, every audience goes home. And when the room grows silent, you are left with yourself, the version of you that does not speak in rehearsed lines or wear curated expressions. The version that feels, the one who aches, the one who remembers being small and unseen, the one who learned long ago that being ordinary was dangerous. The truth is, you have always wanted something simple, to be held without earning it, to be loved without performing, to be understood without needing to explain, to be chosen not for your shine, but for yourself. And this longing is not weakness, it is the most human thing about you. Psychologists say that the first mirror you ever look into is not made of glass, but of another person's eyes. As a child, you searched for yourself in the faces of those around you. You watched to see if your joy mattered, if your sadness was noticed, if your presence made a difference. If those reflections were cold, inconsistent, or conditional, you learned to replace the mirror with a mask that could ensure you were never invisible again. But masks are heavy. They press against the skin. Over time, you forget where the mask ends and the face begins. There is a quiet courage in taking it off. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, tenderly. The way you might open a window in a room that has been closed for years, letting in a little air, a little warmth, a little truth. You begin to realize that love is not something you earn. Connection is not something you perform. Worth is not something you prove. These were lessons taught by fear, not by truth. The real self, the one you buried, the one you protected, does not need applause to exist. It only needs space, and time, and gentleness. So, here is the quiet truth, the one that lingers after the lights fade and the world stops watching. You were not born to be admired. You were born to be known.